Hello, my name is Morikuni Ueda. We are now going to learn about the definition of Japanese sake, its characteristics, and how it is made. The historical roots of sake stretch back to ancient times. People were drinking sake as early as the 8th century. In the Kojiki, an ancient Japanese chronicle, there is a famous story about how sake was used to intoxicate and defeat a menacing serpent called orochi. In addition, the Harima Furoki, an ancient record of provincial history during this era, makes reference to sake brewed using mold. The Engishiki, a book about laws and customs compiled in 927 AD, contains the brewing methods for 15 types of sake, including reishu, which is prepared using steamed rice, koji, and water, and makes reference to sake being served warm. Sake started to become consumed widely during this period, being produced not only at the imperial court, but also at Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines, and private establishments. The role of microorganisms in the production of sake was not known until much later. In 1860, Frenchman Louis Pasteur discovered that microorganisms cause fermentation. Knowledge of fermentation progressed further during the 1890s when it was discovered that alcoholic fermentation is caused by the enzymes inside yeast cells. This discovery led to modern sake brewing. We touched upon the history of Japanese sake, but what actually is Japanese sake? The Liquor Tax Act of Japan defines Japanese sake as an alcoholic beverage made from rice, koji, and water, and has gone through a filtration process. Isn't this a bit unclear? After all, shochu is also made from rice. To clarify, let's look at some specific examples of how Japanese sake differs from other alcoholic beverages, such as shochu, whiskey, wine, and beer. There are three main groups of alcoholic beverage: fermented beverages, distilled beverages, and mixed beverages. As you can see, Japanese sake belongs to the first category, fermented beverages, the same category as beer and wine. However, the raw ingredients of fermented beverages vary depending on the type of beverage. Some beverages are made from fruit, some made from barley, and some are made from rice. Of course, the brewing method also varies. Let's consider this point further. In the case of wine, alcohol is obtained by fermenting the sugars that are inside the grape. The sugar is already present inside the grapes, and so fermentation can take place without the need for saccharification. This fermentation type is therefore called single fermentation. In the case of beer, the barley starch must first be converted into malt sugar by a diastic enzyme called maltase. This sugar is then fermented to yield alcohol. This fermentation type involves two processes of saccharification and fermentation, and the two processes occur separately from one another. In the case of Japanese sake, the starch in the rice is converted into sugar through the use of a diastic enzyme in koji called amylase. At the same time, the sugar content is fermented to yield alcohol. Like beer, Japanese sake brewing involves both saccharification and fermentation. However, saccharification and fermentation occur simultaneously in the same moromi mash. This type of fermentation is therefore called multiple parallel fermentation. I said earlier that rice koji is an essential ingredient for making Japanese sake. So what is koji? Take a look at the schematic diagram and microscope picture. This is a picture of koji mold. It is called Aspergillus oryzae. Rice koji is steamed rice that has been koji mold cultivated into it. Koji mold produces various enzymes which break down the rice starch into sugars, enabling alcoholic fermentation to take place and produce fragrance and taste component precursors. Furthermore, koji mold also produces vitamins and other nutrients required for the cultivation of yeast. The flavor of koji is itself an important flavor component of Japanese sake. The principal enzymes of koji do several things. For example, they break down starch to produce sugars, break down the proteins in the rice to produce amino acids, and break down lipids to produce fatty acids and glycerin. Now take a look at this picture. It is a schematic diagram and microscopic image of yeast. Yeast is a small oval microorganism with a diameter ranging from 4 to 8 micrometers. Yeast does not only cause alcoholic fermentation, it also produces flavor components. Let me summarize the functions of yeast. It produces ethyl alcohol. It produces organic acids. It produces esters, from which is derived a fragrance called ginjoko. It produces the higher alcohols, which give basic aroma. When koji and yeast perform their respective functions together, the various ingredients of Japanese sake are produced and its wonderful flavors are formed. Now let's take a look at the sake brewing process. Here is a chart showing the process. The brewing process begins with polishing brown rice. Sake rice is polished to a much higher degree than table rice and is extremely difficult, delicate work, and it must therefore be polished very carefully in a polishing machine operated by a specialist. Skillfully polishing the rice is the first prerequisite for making delicious sake. The polished rice will then be steamed, and the resulting steamed rice will be used to produce koji, shubo, seed mash, and moromi, main mash. But before this happens, rice is washed thoroughly in water. Washing it this way removes the bran. The rice must then be soaked in water until it has absorbed the right amount of water. Once the rice is primed and ready for steaming, it is put through the steaming process in order to make it easier to ferment. If these steps are followed correctly, the resulting steamed rice will be perfect for fermentation. It is particularly important that the rice is left to soak for the right amount of time. In the case of ginjo rice, which is polished to a higher degree, the optimal soaking time comes down to the second. If the brewer misjudges the soaking time, the resulting steamed rice will be poor in quality. In addition, subtle changes must be made to the texture of the steamed rice depending on the use for koji rice, shubo rice, and moromi mash. A portion of the steamed rice is taken to make koji. The resulting koji is then mixed with water, yeast, and another portion of the steamed rice to produce shubo. What is shubo? Shubo, which can also be called the yeast starter, is a small amount of moromi with a very high concentration of pure yeast cells and an optimal amount of lactic acid. A large amount of good quality yeast cultivated with shubo and the antibacterial properties of the lactic acid help prevent bacterial contamination and ensure the resulting moromi will be safe. I will explain the three-step preparation process for moromi. On the first day, the brewers mix shubo, koji, water, and steamed rice together in a moromi tank. On the second day, they leave the mixture to rest. On the third day, another batch of koji, water, and steamed rice is added to the mixture. On the fourth day, a further batch of koji, water, and steamed rice is added, thus ending the three-step process. This process helps brewers ferment moromi safely because they can maintain an optimal yeast density and ensure that the amount of lactic acid does not dilute excessively. Japanese sake brewers are renowned around the world for their ability to skillfully utilize lactic acid and adeptly control the multiple parallel fermentation process. The moromi is left to ferment for about 20 days in the case of standard sake and about 30 days in the case of ginjoshu. The moromi is then put into a machine where it is filtered to produce sake. The resulting Japanese sake will be turned into a beverage product, The type it becomes depends on the production process. So the sake is now ready to be marketed. Individual products are differentiated based on factors such as whether or not refining filtration has occurred and whether or not the sake was pasteurized by heating. Let's look into this matter further. If the sake has undergone refining filtration, dilution with water, and then a secondary filtration process called microfiltration before finally being bottled, it will be marketed as namazake. If the sake is stored for a while, filtrated, diluted, and then pasteurized before finally being bottled, it will be marketed as nama chozushu. If the sake is pasteurized, stored, diluted, and then pasteurized again, it will be marketed as standard Japanese sake. If the sake is not diluted, it will be marketed as genshu. I hope you now have some idea how Japanese sake is defined, what its characteristics are, and how it is made. Japanese sake is made using distinct sake brewing methods whose origins trace back to ancient times. Japanese sake is painstakingly produced from rice, the primary staple food of the Japanese diet. For this very reason, it complements beautifully Japan's culinary culture and climate, which is distinctive 4 seasons. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, the 4 seasons. Japanese sake is an elegant beverage that embodies the very soul of Japanese people.